Winter of 1944. The camp lay like a wound on the plain. Rows of barracks swallowed by smoke and an acrid tang that never left the throat. Trains still arrived at dawn and dusk with their load of tired bodies and hushed names. In the open yard, where dawn light cut through wire and watchtowers, a small hand slipped from a larger one and was lost in the shuffle. The child was no older than 8, hair matted with grime, cheeks hollow with cold and hunger, clutching a scrap of bread as if it were a talisman. The cold bit through thin clothing and made every movement a small defeat. Around him, the clatter of boots, the bark of orders, and the metallic sense of ration tins composed a sound that would be remembered as a kind of daily violence. In a guard post, a young soldier observed without judgment at first, because that was the shape in which duty had been taught to him. His name was Hans, he was 27, and the uniform had become a language he spoke without thinking. Hans had been stationed at the camp for months. The shape of the place had carved lines into his face more than the winter had. Where others tightened with zeal, he moved with a stiffness that was more survival than conviction. He watched the child fall sideways among the boots and felt something like a memory push against the training. It was a small thing, a hesitation, but it would fold out into the rest of the story. He could have looked away. He did not. Hans had been raised in a small town by a mother named Marta and a father who worked at the mill. As a boy, he had learned to read by candlelight and to repair clocks with his father, hands memorizing cogs and patience. He had courted a woodworker's daughter, Anna, with shy notes folded into the pocket of his jacket, and had imagined a life of small routines and steady bread. When his father fell ill and the mill slowed, Hans found himself pulled into service for reasons that were practical rather than ideological. He believed in order, in keeping his mother warm and fed, in the promise that uniform brought pay and bread. Those needs had hardened into a duty that felt almost sacred. Yet in the spaces between roll calls and inspections, he still read the same lines he had as a child, and listened for the click of clockwork, for the rhythm that reminded him the world was not only commands. At the camp, the first months had been an accumulation of small compromises. Hans learned to speak with the voice he thought others wanted. He learned to check his face for softness. He learned to keep his hands where they would not be noticed. But memory lived in gestures. He remembered once a river in spring, the smell of mud and riverweed, his sister Elise, dragging a stick like a sword, laughing with loud, unembarrassed joy. Those memories were private contraband. They softened him at a place in his chest that the uniform could not seal. The sight of the boy on the ground tapped that place. It called up a tenderness he had not allowed himself to own since leaving home. The first scene of contact was almost absurd in its simplicity. The child dropped his bread, and a guard shouted. A stone of panic passed through the crowd. Hans moved as if his feet were chains, and yet he found himself stepping closer. He said nothing at first. He stooped, picked up the small crust, and placed it in the child's palm. The boy looked at him as if surprised by color in a black and white photograph. Around them, orders bubbled like a distant sea, the bark of sergeants, the clink of metal. A fellow guard, Friedrich, glanced over, his breath a white cloud, and shrugged as if to say nothing was happening. Hans stepped back into his post and let the image of the boy with the bread hang like a photograph behind his eyes. In the following nights, Hans began to fold small things into his coat to bring to the boy. A piece of boiled potato made the boy close his eyes with a hunger softened for a moment. Scraps of newspaper became a blanket for a trembling shoulder. These gestures were tiny acts performed under the full weight of risk. The boy who accepted them was named David by his mother before the rail car separated them. Anna, the mother, had been taken during that first round of selection, and her name lived inside the boy's small utterances, a song he hummed when the cold was too sharp. Other named figures filled the edges of the camp. Captain Weber, who walked with a cane and a suspicious eye. Sokolov, the railroad man who looked away when eyes begged. Jakob, a fellow prisoner who traded stories for a bright button. Marta, the camp cook, who slid an extra spoonful when she dared. Heinrich, the corporal, who hummed off-key and praised routine. Each of these people moved the atmosphere in small degrees, creating pockets where something human could still be passed hand to hand. Their bond grew by stages. First there was food and furtive glances. Then came whispers. One night, under a sky smeared with smoke and a thin crescent of hidden moon, Hans approached, and instead of dropping food, he asked the boy his name in a voice that tried to be casual. The boy answered with a soft defiance. Their conversation lengthened with each encounter. On one such night, they spoke openly enough that a listener might have been able to follow the thread. The exchange was simple and then deeper. 4 distinct turns of give and take that entered the space between two people not allowed to belong together. Hans said, "Are you
hungry?" David answered. "Yes." Hans asked, "Where is your mother?" David said, "I do not know." Hans said, "Do you remember her hands?" David replied, "They smelled like soup." Hans said, "Hold on to that smell." David answered, "I will." Sensory details braided those moments into memory. The air tasted of ash and tea tannin. The metal of the mess tin warmed cold fingers. The fabric of the boy's sleeve felt like burlap against Hans's palm. The sound of distant hammers became a metronome. The light from the barrack lamp threw hard shadows on faces and made every expression sharp. The smell of boiled cabbage and stale bread lingered in the hair of those who worked near the kitchen. Each of these senses became punctuation in a relationship that was fragile and forbidden. As months passed, the risk accumulated. Rumors moved through the camp like mice in the rafters. Captain Weber announced new inspections and the presence of a visiting officer whose reports could mean extra measures. Frederick, the storekeeper, had noticed missing items and had begun to tally them in a small book. Hans felt the net tightening. He began to act with increasing care. Once he was nearly caught when Jakob, the prisoner, out of a desperate need to barter, nearly spoke of the small man who had slipped him a spoon. Hans had to intervene with a rumor of his own, redirecting suspicion toward an imagined thief named Peters. He lied with a face that felt like a mask slipping. 3 moments of real danger marked their existence, and each required an expansion of courage. The first such moment came on a rain night when guards made a surprise roll call and the boy was not in his place. The rain turned mud into a heavy adhesive that sucked at boots. Hans had to explain the empty space by creating a story about a transfer. He did so with a voice that trembled but held steady. He spoke in front of Heinrich and Captain Weber, his words measured, his palms dry, though his throat felt full of river water. The second moment arrived when a crate was found with the name Anna scratched on the wood, and Captain Weber ordered a search. The camp fell into a hum of fear. Hans felt his chest press like a fist. He lied about the crate's timing and said it belonged to a different shipment. The third moment was when a nervous guard called Sokolov claimed he had seen Hans speaking too long with the prisoner. The accusation could have been a death knell. Hans met the charge with an explosion of procedural rhetoric, invoking logs, shifts, and registry. He shifted the conversation to paperwork until the officer's irritation dissolved into bureaucratic fatigue. Each moment of tension lasted and replayed in the small hours. The rain night memory was a narrow corridor of sensory detail, the slap of rain on canvas, the cold that numbed fingers.
To pins and pins of pain, the smell of wet wool and the metallic tang of nervous blood at the lip of a cut. The cracked voice of Captain Weber asked for names, and Hans offered them with the precision of a man reading a list. The crate search was louder, the scrape of wood on wood, the clank of metal, the sour breath of men. The accusation by Sokolov felt quieter but sharper, like the click of a trap catching, and it sent a tremor through the camp that made the boy tuck his face into an elbow and breathe like someone trying to hold a thought together. The plan to move the boy out of immediate danger grew out of necessity and the simplest human logic. If the boy could be registered as a laborer transferred to a nearby infirmary for work, a window might open. Hans recruited a handful of people by degrees. He spoke to Marta, the cook, who knew the movements of food trolleys and the names on rear manifests. He pulled in Jakob, who still had contacts in the gray market, and a local sympathizer named Peter, who worked on the rail lines and owed a favor. He even, at great risk, found a way to make Friedrich look the other way for certain hours by promising a small bribe of tobacco and by playing on old town loyalties. Each person received a clear task and a piece of information. The plan required timing, courage, and a lot of luck. The conversation that stitched the plan together was tense and composed of multiple direct exchanges. At least 5 precise turns among Hans, Jakob, Marta, Peter, and Friedrich. Each reply layering secrecy, fear, and practical instruction. Hans said, "We move during the 3rd watch." Jakob said, "I can open the side gate for 2 minutes." Marta said, "I will mark the infirmary list." Peter said, "The railman owes me a favor." Friedrich said, "I will look away, but I need tobacco later." Hans said, "Bring it." Jakob said, "Be fast." Marta said, "If you are caught, I will deny it." Peter said, "We will all lose something." Preparations filled hours with sensory detail. The rust taste on metal, the softness of cloth used to muffle footsteps, the greasy smell of grease used on a lock, the trembling of hands that could not stop. The boy David slept fitfully, cheeks flushed with fever one night, and Hans sat nearby holding a cup of tea that tasted of sugar and old hope. The night of the escape was alive with weather and texture. Rain pounded as if trying to erase footprints. Mud clung to boots and made every movement heavy. The smell of wet earth rose up, and the noise of distant trains muffled conversation. The watchtower lights cut the yard into staccato squares. Hans led with a steady face and a heart that was a drumbeat too loud in his ears. The escape itself was close. The boy clung to Hans' jacket. They slipped through a door left open by Jakob only for the breath of a minute. Friedrich, as promised, turned his head at the required instant and hummed a song off-key while he shuffled papers. Martha had falsified the infirmary list with a shaky script that looked like a tired clerk's hand. Peter had arranged a crate to cover the half-open gate and had kept 2 workmen busy at the precise corner where the guard's view might be blocked. They moved under the smell of rain and iron, and the sound of a dog barking in the distance that made everyone hold their breath. For a moment, it seemed like the plan would unspool into disaster when a patrol rounded the corner earlier than scheduled, and Hans had to step into the light and speak with a calm that belied the pulse at his throat. He spoke of routine checks and of manifest discrepancies, and the patrol passed. Only when they were outside the wire and in a field of churned mud did any of them allow themselves a breath that could be counted as relief. But the consequence of such a rescue was never simple. Captain Weber noticed a mismatch in roles, and a report began that would suture suspicion into accusation. Hans was pulled from his post and brought before an officer whose eyes were wooden and patient. The interrogation was a sequence of questions that felt like blows. Hans had to make choices about what he would own and what he would throw away. He could claim ignorance and survive, or he could try to protect the boy and accept a price. In the gray office with a single lamp burning and a paper cup of stale coffee sweating in the cold, Hans answered with a measured voice and a lie that concealed too much tenderness. He gave names of imagined smugglers. He invented an alternate theory and rehearsed it like a prayer. The hearings that followed were summary and swift. There was a formal note, a charge of dereliction and misconduct, and a warning that was thinly veiled. For his part, Hans accepted a posting elsewhere, a transfer that read like exile. He signed papers with a hand that trembled and left a crumpled note in the pocket of the boy's jacket that contained nothing but a smudged sketch of a river and the words, "Remember the river." While Hans moved away, the boy was taken under the care of a small, quiet network. Martha and Jakob arranged for David to be moved to a farm outside the zone, where a family named the Rosas took him in under a forged name. Peter delivered the crate with a face that looked as if it had been in dirt for too long. The immediate aftermath was a mixture of grief, relief, and practical rearrangement. Hans, sent to a distant post, lived with the weight of distance. He would later write a short letter that never reached the boy because it was intercepted in a later sweep. In camp, the network of small resistances kept his head low and its stories folded into other stories. But the life of the boy continued. It is at this point that we pause to ask you to share. Think for a moment about the mix of outrage and hope you feel. Many watching will say the obvious indignation and also a startled gratitude. Have you ever seen or heard of a small act of kindness that felt like a rebellion? Share one line in the comments beginning with, "Once I saw." Tell us about a moment when someone crossed the line of fear to help another human being. Your comment matters because it becomes part of a living memory, and we select some stories to feature in future episodes. This community holds those small sparks and carries them forward. Now return with us to the story to see how the choices made in one winter shaped decades. Months stretched into years, and consequences spread like rings from a stone. Hans would be transferred and watched. He worked in cold outposts and learned to sleep with a silence that had teeth. Jakob was moved to a harsher barrack. Marta's ration was cut and she fell ill with a fever that took her weeks. Peter kept his favor and paid for it with nights of guilt that tasted like ash. The Rosa's family risked everything to keep David and taught him to sow beans and mend nets. The boy grew under a borrowed name and learned to measure days by planting and harvest rather than roll calls. He did not forget the texture of the bread that had been handed to him or the rough voice that had asked him to remember his mother's hands. That command became an anchor. Decades later, the legacy began to show itself in small certainties. 1 month after the escape, the camp's registers showed an anomaly, noted in pencil and then erased. People whispered. 3 months after the escape, Hans wrote a short note that he tucked into a seam of a coat and mailed to Marta back home. She kept it folded in a wooden box and read it once every winter. 6 months after the event, the Rosas family had moved David to a safer town, and he began school, where a teacher named Elsa taught him letters and the sound of reading aloud. He learned to write his name in ink that smeared but dried, and to fold paper boats to float on rain puddles. Those small acts of ordinary life were a kind of restitution that no tribunal could properly measure. The years that followed carried different shapes of reckoning. Legal processes after the war registered names and incidents in stacks of files and courtrooms. Some men were tried and others escaped accountability in the confusion of collapse. Hans's name was filed in a report under a vague category that did not capture the small, impossible kindness he had shown. He lived with that as a secret that neither redeemed nor condemned him completely. David grew into a man called by the name his foster family used, and yet in private he kept a folded sketch of a river and the faint script, "Remember the river." He married, had children, and taught them the small law of kindness that had been his saving. In time, the story shifted from a private memory to a public one. Decades later, when survivors and witnesses began to gather testimonies, Marta's box of letters was opened and names were shared. Jakob's daughter came forward with a list. Peter's grandson, who had found an old tobacco tin filled with forgotten pledges, told the tale. A group of people who had once moved in the margins of danger came together to testify to what they had done. Memories were messy. Documents did not always match, but the kernel persisted. A uniformed man had bent, had chosen to protect a child at the cost of his own uncomplicated safety. The final measure of consequence is never a tidy ledger. One consequence was legal and bureaucratic. Another was the private weight of choices on a life. And yet there was something else, less quantifiable but real. The boy's children and grandchildren grew up with a story about a man named Hans who had done something inexplicable. They kept a photograph that showed the river, though the sketch was only outline and smudge. They told it at tables and on long journeys. The story became part of their instructive lore, a small instruction book on how to behave when the world tilted toward cruelty. In an epilogue that unfolded across months and years, the larger arc became clearer. 1 month after the escape, The boy David sat at a rough table in a safe home and learned to read a line from a book, the letters making a sound that felt like return. He put his finger on the page and felt the texture of paper that was not ration slip. The smell of ink and wood filled the room, and for a moment it felt like the world had been turned towards something salvageable. 3 months after the escape, the family that sheltered him took him to the river and showed him how to fold paper boats. The water carried them, and for the first time in a long span, he let a memory go without clutching. He watched the boats drift and realized that a life could be given away into motion and still be there to remember. The rain had made mud before, and now it made patterns that he learned to read like a secret language. 6 months after the escape, the papers that had mentioned Hans surfaced in a stack. The files given to a committee investigating past abuses. A clerk found a folded sketch and a note and passed them to a curator who did not scoff but kept them. Years later, the sketch would be placed in a small archive alongside correspondence and testimony. Hans himself, older now and living in a quiet house near an old mill, never sought recognition. He kept his own set of regrets and small consolations. He visited the river alone on certain mornings and thought of a child clutching bread. He had no illusions about absolution. He carried instead a memory smoothed by time and sorrow and the odd brightness of a saved life. What remains most necessary to say is this: the rescue did not erase the atrocity. It did not transform the structure that made such choices morally necessary. It did, however, create a line of human contact that ran against the grain of cruelty. It left consequences, debts, gratitude, and a fragile hope. There are those who would ask what one person can do in the face of machinery that grinds. The answer appears in small acts repeated until they make a pattern. A piece of bread, a falsified name, a turned head, a hand that did not obey the unrelenting command to look away. That pattern stitched the child to future days. If this story moved you, if it stirred indignation and a quiet gratitude, consider joining this community of memory. Subscribe to follow more narratives that examine how small acts of compassion altered outcomes in terrible times. Share the comment that begins, "Once I saw," and tell of a kindness that surprised you. These stories matter because they keep alive the idea that humanity can persist in the most dangerous places. May the remembered bread and the sketch of the river remain a witness to what one choice can begin.